He was a police officer and eventually became a college professor and author. He's here to talk about the daily grind, how the stress, adrenaline, and trauma affected him, his marriage, relationships, and shaped his future. Welcome to the Law Enforcement Today radio show. I'm your host. My name's John J. Wiley. In addition to being a radio broadcaster, I'm a retired police sergeant. For the latest news articles and much more, check out our website, letradioshow.com. In the Law Enforcement Today show, we'll be joined by special guests. We'll be talking about their experiences and issues affecting law enforcement officers, first responders, their families, their community, and victims of horrendous crimes. Be sure to like us on Facebook. Our page is Law Enforcement Today Radio Show. Check out the daily articles on our website, letradioshow.com. And while you're there, download our free app. Another reason to like and follow us on Facebook. The mobile Facebook app, you can listen to the podcast there for free. So if you ever miss an episode of Law Enforcement Today show, it's always on the mobile Facebook app. You know, the one on your phone, which is free. It's easy to access the podcast and great articles, much more. By the way, feel free to send me a message. Say hello. If I can help you, let me know. That's on our Facebook page. Do a search on Facebook for Law Enforcement Today radio show. Be sure to click like and follow. Calling us from Texas, we have Will Moravits on the phone. Will is a former police officer turned college professor, a professor of political science for St. Philip's College and Texas State University. He was a police officer at the city of San Marcos, Texas, and also is an author of the book, The Blue Divide, Policing and Race in America. Will, thanks so much for being a guest on the Law Enforcement Today show. Very much appreciated.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor.
And by the way, thank you for your service. That's appreciated as well.
I appreciate that. Thank you, too.
You did 3 years in San Marcos, Texas. First of all, please excuse my ignorance. Whereabouts is San Marcos, Texas? Where's it located?
San Marcos is between San Antonio and Austin.
Gotcha. And your 3 years, is it safe to say that police work wasn't what you expected, or was it more intense than you expected?
It was different than what I expected. I wouldn't say it was not what I expected. You know, I think the thing that was difficult for me was balancing family life with law enforcement. So the job itself was more or less what I had thought it would be, because I had friends in law enforcement and family who had told me, but it was that aspect of managing a marriage with, you know, young children and the job, because I was working night shift. That was the part that I wasn't expecting.
I hated midnight shift work. Well, and when I started in police work, I was single. So and I was young. I went to the academy at 21 and turned, I think, 22 in the academy. So I was a very young man when I hit the streets. You know, and I'm a different generation than you, Will. I was influenced heavily by Joseph Wambaugh, his books, the television series. I thought I knew what I was expecting when I came into police work. I thought I had a really good idea of what was heading my way. When I went to Baltimore after a couple of years, it was far more intense, far more violent, far more traumatic, and a heck of a lot more adrenaline rushes than I ever imagined.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, my generation, we grew up watching cops, you know, on TV, and, you know, that's pretty realistic stuff. Now they have live PD and other things. San Marcos is kind of one of those cities. It's a fairly large city. It's not like, you know, it's not like San Antonio or Austin, but it's a fairly large city. And you do have violent crime. You do have a lot of drugs, especially with the college group there. But, you know, it's not as often as you would see like in a major metropolitan area. So it was a little different for me. You know, most of the kind of stuff that got to me was when people you're dealing with just treated you a certain way just because of the uniform you had on. That was something that, you know, I had grown up in a small town where everybody knew me and everybody liked me, or almost everybody liked me, and, you know, people trusted me. And then I show up in that uniform and it's like, they look at you like you're a pig, you know, like you're a scum. Not everybody, of course, but a lot of people do. And that and seeing that negativity day in and day out, going to calls where, you see first time I kind of teared up on the job. I walked in, it's like 2 a.m. It was pouring down rain. We're in this mobile home. I walk in because there was a domestic violence call, and I was the backing officer. So the lead officer had already arrived and said the assailants were gone. But I walk in, and there's maybe about an 18-month-old baby in diapers playing in his daddy's blood, just kind of patting the blood, like, what's this, kind of thing. And I just, those are the kind of things that got to me, the negativity, and then seeing kids hurt, seeing, people who have kids committing violent crime, because it's like, you have priorities at home. In my mind, it was like, you have priorities at home. You shouldn't be living your life this way, things of that nature.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. The kid stuff was really tough for me to handle back then. And I know it's an overused term, I'm still haunted a bit by some of those things. And crimes against children really got to me. Violent crimes against children, especially by parents and so-called loved ones, really got to me. But seeing children in very traumatic situations where their parents, for lack of better words, were victims of violent crime really got to me. And one of the things, seeing that kind of trauma is one thing. Seeing and experiencing all the time the degradation and the lack of hope and all these things that people live with in elements of society really wore down on me after many years. Got to the point where it shaped me in a way where I became very cynical and very negative.
Yeah, and I think that was starting to happen to me. You'd warned me about that in the academy, and they talked about things like having friends that are outside of law enforcement, or, just having a life away from the job as much as you can. And you're right with the kids. I had a really good department that was very heavily focused on training and preparation. There was no expense too great for them to get good training for you. And a lot of the older guys, would say this to me. It's like, you'll see stuff on the job. Eventually you can get numb to some of it, but you'll never get numb to seeing kids get hurt, especially because I was already a parent. My first child was actually born right after I got off of FTO. And so those are the things that it did start to get jaded. I think that affected my marriage as well, because what I tell people is you're never called for anything positive. You're always called, even if it's just a little minor verbal disturbance, all the way up to a murder or things of that nature. You're there. You have, I've held hands with people who lost a family member, and I had to be the one telling them. I've sat next to a grieving woman after she was raped and tried to console her while also taking the report. And you see that day in and day out, and it does make you cynical. It does make you, jaded to a certain extent, and unfortunately that spills out into the rest of our personal life as well.
And unfortunately, who catches it a lot of time is the people we want to protect. And I can't speak for you, but I didn't want to talk to my wife at the time about the things we saw, the things we did. Number one, she worried enough already. She was an emergency room nurse in Baltimore. She knew the trauma. She knew a lot of police. She knew what was happening. I didn't want her to ever think, especially when she was pregnant with her first child, hey, things are really bad. And I came close to losing it tonight. I came close to either losing my stuff myself or being killed myself. I never wanted her to be concerned. And unfortunately, what happened for me, and we'll talk about this when we return, is I wound up isolating from those who I love the most and whose company and attention I needed the most, and wound up pushing them away. I didn't mean to do it, but that's what I did. That's a reality, and that's a byproduct of, at least for me, this job. This is Law Enforcement Today Show. We're talking with Will Moravits. We're going to take a short break. I promise you, you don't want to miss us heading away. We're back in just a few moments. Want to win great prizes in awesome contests? Who wouldn't want that? It's easy. Just sign up and subscribe for the Law Enforcement Today radio show email newsletter. We won't spam you. No more than 2 emails a week. I promise. All subscribers are automatically entered in all future contests. Sign up at letradioshow.com. Scroll down to the sign-up area. That's letradioshow.com.
The Officer Down Memorial Podcast tells the real stories of the men and women we've lost in the line of duty.
It is one of the darkest days in Itasca County's history.
From the officers who were there.
He's probably maybe one of the best investigators and a natural-born one.
And family and friends who were left behind.
You try and get distance from people's tragedies, but the death of Beefy, it just shot home to all of us how permanent murder is.
You can subscribe to the Officer Down Memorial Podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts.
This is Alone for Today's show. Returning our conversation with Will Moravits. Will was a police officer in San Marcos, Texas for about 3 years, and he left. He is now a professor of political science for St. Philip's College and Texas State University. And this is all in Texas, and he's also author of the book, The Blue Divide, Policing and Race in America. Before we went to break, a couple things you said, Will, that really resonated with me. Number one is people before, out of uniform, they viewed me a certain way. They viewed me as an individual, as a person, my good points, my bad points, and took the whole thing. However, once I put the uniform, it was no longer Jay Wiley, the person, John J. Wiley, the individual. Right. It was, you're a cop. And people treated you different. And here was the thing that people told me in the early days, the old-time cops. Two things. Don't try to make sense out of stuff that makes no sense at all. It'll drive you insane. And the other one's don't take it personal. It's awfully hard not to take things personally when it's directed at you, and especially when it's physical violence and or threat of death directed at you. It's very difficult not to take it personal.
Yeah, and for me, I was right out of college. I was actually a youth minister in a town close to San Marcos, and then 9/11 happened, and that was kind of my call that I wanted to do something different, give back to the community, and policing was something that interested me. And of course, the heroism of the firefighters and the Port Authority Police and NYPD on that day, just kind of I've always wanted to help people. And so I was like, that's a great way, to give back. And so I go in there with a little bit of rose-colored glasses in a sense, because I'm thinking I'm here to help people. I want to protect people, and then you show up and it's like they either don't want your help or they're fighting with you. They're threatening you, they're threatening your family. And that threw me for a loop early. In field training, I remember, my first field trainer was a wonderful officer named Rudy Mesa. He unfortunately lost his life in Iraq a couple years after he was my trainer. But I remember the very first arrest we made together, somebody, the guy, the perp was like, I'm going to come after your family. I'm going to kill him and all this kind of stuff. And he just kind of shrugged it off. And I asked him later, I was like, how do you deal with that? And he's like, he's just like, I have a wife, I have kids. They know how to handle themselves. If somebody approaches them in town, and says, hey, your dad or your grandpa, whatever, arrested me. But he said, you can't really let it get to you, because you'd be worried all the time looking over your shoulder, and it's not a good way to live. And he said, in reality, there's a lot of these people, at least in San Marcos, were just talking, they were just talking.
Just talking. That's basically. It's coming out of their mouth. There's nothing behind it. And that's one of the things that I hate to say this. I'll admit it on the radio. It got to the point where I would say, tough talk doesn't make a tough man. And I'm not. Right. I'm not talking about John Wayne macho stuff. Look, if you want to threaten me, you better be real. Otherwise, stop talking.
Right.
And it's difficult when they threaten your family. I'll recall this. I was married. My wife had one baby already. She was pregnant with our second child, and we lived out in the country outside of Baltimore, and almost near Pennsylvania line. And it was the dead end, and we had a long, about quarter-mile dirt driveway. And she called me one day because a vehicle showed up in front of the house. And it's like a farmette. There's no reason to be there. And a lot of stuff was happening. Right. There's death threats against me and everything else. She was freaking out. She knew how to handle herself. She knew all that stuff. She had been trained in weapons. She had many years working as an emergency room nurse. She saw the trauma, but it still messed with her head. And I'll tell you what, it really got to me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's when you have somebody you love, like your spouse or your kids, and you feel like they're being threatened, and you may not be there to protect them. That's a really scary thing. have to deal with. And I was a little bit fortunate because I lived in San Antonio for, I guess, the first year or so, and then we moved to New Braunfels, which is just outside of San Antonio before you get to San Marcos. So I didn't go about my day-to-day business in the city of San Marcos. So like I wasn't at, the local grocery store, you go in there and people recognize you and they're like, hey, you did this or whatever. I didn't have to worry about that so much because I didn't live in the community. I lived outside of it. But it is scary to think that. And for me, a lot of the things that would happen, like on a slow night, it'd be like, 3, 4 in the morning. And I'd start thinking about what's going to happen to my wife and kids if something happens to me on the job. Are they going to be okay? And so, some of those thoughts would creep in. You just kind of have to shrug them off, and get back focused, because you can't, being distracted on the job is a very dangerous thing. But what really, me being jaded, and then with my spouse, she wasn't really afraid of her safety. She wasn't fearful for her safety, but what got to her, we're now since divorced. That's really the reason ultimately why I left law enforcement. When we had our first child, it was very difficult for her to be up at night with a crying kid at 2 a.m, and then she calls me for kind of comfort, and then I'm like, I can't talk, I got to go. There's something going on. She kind of felt like I wasn't there for her. She went basically from being supportive of the job, because we were married before I became an officer. She was very supportive of it, to once we had kids, it started to be like the job is in the way of things, and she became less and less supportive. She would give me when I'd get called, hey, we need there's somebody out today, can you come up, work an extra shift or something? And I'd go, and she'd just give me all sorts of for it, like I was abandoning her some way. And so that really took a toll on me as well, because you fight at home, and then you go into work, and it's like you got to shut that off, and it's not that easy to do sometimes.
The other aspect of this too, and I got to ask you, when you work night shift, look, people can joke all you want, they can mock it. Part of me feels like I have an obligation to make sure my family's okay. When you're leaving to go to work at 10 o'clock, 10:30 at night, and you be gone all night long, and bad things could potentially happen, you feel an obligation to make sure you're there to take care of your family, protect them. Were you ever troubled by that you weren't there?
Yeah, I mean, because I'm sure if something, drastic happened, my sergeant would just be like, all right, just go. So they're real supportive of that kind of thing. But there was that fear, especially since I was living out of town, my commute back to home, should something happen, was going to be a lot longer than if I'd lived, within the city of San Marcos, especially when I was in San Antonio, and with no traffic, that was a 45-minute drive. With traffic, on the way home in the morning, I would, take an hour and a half sometimes because of morning rush hour.
We were talking to Will Moravits on the Law Enforcement Today show. Will was a former police officer in San Marcos, Texas. He left law enforcement. We're going to talk more about the reason why. He's now a professor of political science at St. Philip's College and Texas State University. And he's also author of the book, The Blue Divide, Policing and Race in America. So much more to talk about. Heading your way into Law Enforcement Today show. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back. There's only one official Facebook page. What you do a search on Facebook for Law Enforcement Today radio show. Click like and follow. There you'll find updates about upcoming episodes of the radio show. You can contact me. We also find unique, one-of-a-kind editorials and news articles. That is our Facebook page, Law Enforcement Today radio show. Be sure to click like and follow. We'll see you there.
Are you wondering where you can find more great podcasts? Head to letradioshow.com, click Be Heard, and discover other fantastic podcasts like this one. Also available on our free app, all at letradioshow.com.
This is Law Enforcement Today Show. Return our conversation with Will Moravits. Will is a former police officer. He was a police officer in San Marcos, Texas. He is now a college professor of political science for St. Philip's College and Texas State University. He's also the author of the book, The Blue Divide, Policing and Race in America. I promise you, Will, no wise cracks or jokes from me about college professors, especially political science. I'm not getting it. That one is a lot of what people take that for is the next step into law. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's definitely true. There's, a lot of people that do the political science route that go into to become a lawyer, or they go into politics, work for the State Department, things like that. Yeah, for sure.
There was a time when it would seem like an anomaly where a former cop becomes a professor, or a former cop becomes a lawyer, or retired, or whatever the situation might be. It's not that unusual. What may seem unusual is that you're a professor of political science. But before we get into why you do what you do, I want to go back to you being a police officer. You're married. You've got a young child born right after you leave FTO. And the wear and tear of police work and not being available, working shift work, working overnights began to take its toll on your relationship at home.
Yeah, so, it didn't happen all at once. I was fortunate enough to be able to take some paternity leave time with the first child for, a few, I think it was like 3 weeks to help out, and again, things in the early parts were not that difficult. It built up over time to the point where, and my ex-wife she still has the business, but she was a dental lab technician, had her own shop, and it was growing, and so her time started to be more valuable because it was limited. And the reality is, in her mind, I think she looked at it as, well, my job makes more money than yours, so it's more important. And so you should be don't go into to do overtime or to take an extra shift because you need to be here, with this. And it's not the same thing. I mean, obviously, policing isn't just a regular job. For most people that I met, probably 120 or so officers I met in my brief career, the vast majority did it as a calling. They wanted to help people. They wanted to make a difference. And so the pay is really kind of, it's great if you get good pay, and my department did pay well for its size. But it's not just a job. You can just be like, hey, I'm going to call in sick today because, it's a calling, and you really are never truly off duty. Like when I go home after a day in the classroom, it's all out of my mind. I don't worry about what's going to happen or whatever, but you can't do that as a cop. And I think that also got to her a little bit. And eventually, she was in the mindset where the business was growing so much, and I was having to help her with the finance part of the business. And she's like, you need to leave the force to spend more time with the business and the family and everything, better for our finances and all that kind of stuff. And, it had been a struggle up to that point. There were some times on the job where what was happening at home affected my performance. And I talked to my sergeant and one of my commanders about that in a meeting, because people kind of had noticed that there was a little bit of a change from what I, early my performance. And then, I did pick it back up that last 6-7 months that I was an officer. I kind of went back to being a high performing police officer, and people started noticing that as well. But at home, it was still very tough. It was very emotional and stressful. And you're right. You mentioned earlier, talking to your spouse about what you see on the job. It's not something that a lot of people do, especially if they're not law enforcement themselves. You have some couples that are in law enforcement together, then you can do that a lot easier. But at the end of the day, I guess, I was raised by a single mom for first 8 or 9 years of my life, and then she married my stepdad. My biological father was not in the picture at all until my 20s, really, when my son was born. And so I was a little fearful that if I put my foot down and said, no, I want to stay a cop, that it would lead to divorce, and so part of my reasoning, and I didn't express it to her at the time, the part of my reasoning for quitting was just to try to save the marriage, because I was afraid. I didn't want to be divorced. I didn't want my kids to grow up with me not there every day. And unfortunately, all it did was prolong the inevitable, I guess, because about a year and a half later, she filed for divorce. And, you know, I thought about it. I remember talking to my uncle and some people, and I was telling them stories about the job, you know, some of the funny stuff that you see. And they're like, you know, you seem so animated when you talk about it. Have you thought about going back? And I was like, yeah, I have. But I had a 2.5-year-old and a 1-year, you know, basically like a 1-year-old. And I just remembering what it was like for me to not have my dad, wondering where he was, when's he going to come visit, and that kind of stuff. I didn't want them to go through that same thing. And so I kind of thought to myself, you know,
look, yeah. I don't question your motives for leaving. And here's something I'm just going to say this for me. There's an incredible amount of responsibility as a police officer. Like you said, we're on duty 24/7, and that's a rough thing for a lot of people to deal with. The other thing is, look, you get called in, hey, we're short, can you come in? There's a tremendous amount of guilt and responsibility feeling towards your brothers and sisters that I can't let them down. Right. I got to pull my weight. Right. And to be honest with you, I wanted to be the one that's like, hey, when there's real bad stuff happening, you need Jay Wiley. You need him on. When stuff hits a fan, you want this guy coming in. I wanted to be that guy so bad that I put a lot of unnecessary pressure on myself, my family, as a result. So I get you really stuck where you like, look, I don't know what I want to do here. And I don't envy your position.
Yeah, well, either way, it was a lose. It was a lose situation. You know, if I went to shift work, you know, on an extra shift, or if I stayed late, you know, sometimes I'd get off at 7 a.m. and they'd be like, "Hey, someone on the morning shift, you know, have to take the day off. Can you stay till noon?" And we'll try to find somebody on the afternoon shift, on the swing shift, to come in early. You know, and so you end up working, you know, 15, 18-hour shift, but you feel guilty because you're like, I should be home, whatever, it's my time with my family. And then on the other hand, you're like, but my brothers and sisters in blue need me. It's my responsibility. So either choice you make, whether you take the extra shift or you stay home, there's a sense of guilt and a sense of like you're letting someone down. You know, and that was tough for me too, you know, because I'm the sense, you know, kind of like what you're saying, where you know, Jay Wiley needs to be there. I always wanted to kind of play the hero. I guess it's kind of.
It sounds comical and it sounds stupid to say that at this point of our lives, but the truth is, I wanted to be that guy. I wanted to be Superman to the rescue.
Exactly. You know, I mean, I grew up, you know, reading superhero comic books, and so I've always kind of, you know, my mobile laptop and my patrol car, I had, you know, at the top of it, with great power comes great responsibility, which is a Spider-Man quote from his uncle before he dies. But to me, that was a big part of how I perform my job, is that I have great power, but there's great responsibility that comes with it.
A great way of putting it. You know, it's almost embarrassing to say it came from Spider-Man, because it's a great quote. This is the Law Enforcement Today show. We are talking with Will Moravits, former police officer, college professor, and also author of the book, The Blue Divide, Policing and Race in America. When we return after a few moments, we're going to talk about leaving police work, becoming a college professor, and what motivated him to do what he does today. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Miss an episode of Law Enforcement Today? You don't have to anymore, because now you can listen to it on Podopolo, the free new app that makes listening anytime, anywhere so easy. Catch up on shows you've missed and chat with John J. Wiley right there too. Download for free on the Apple or Google Play stores. That's Podopolo. And John J. Wiley wants to hear from you inside Podopolo.
This is a Law Enforcement Today show. Return our conversation with Will Moravits. Will is in Texas. He was a police officer at San Marcos, Texas Police Department. He left because of how it was affecting his marriage. We'll talk about that again in a few moments. Became a professor, a college professor of political science for St. Philip's College and Texas State University. He's also author of the book, The Blue Divide, Policing and Race in America. And I got to say this, he holds a Master of Arts in Political Science from Texas State University, and there's more, a PhD in Public Policy and Administration from Walden University. I got to tell you, I'm impressed. Well, that's a lot.
Well, I appreciate that. And it's funny, earlier you mentioned that it's not so uncommon for police officers to retire and go into law or some other things. And I found out my old police chief retired in 2014, and he went and got his PhD, and now he's a professor of criminal justice at Texas State. And we got to meet for lunch for a couple hours and, talk about the old days. And I apologized to him, because I said, hey, my career did not work out the way that I wanted it to. And, I never intended it to be such a short stint. And I kind of felt all these years later, I kind of felt guilty still. And he was like, look, plans are what happens when life is what happens when you're making plans. Yeah. And he's like, don't feel guilty about it. You did your service. You did a good job.
That's right. You serve with honor and integrity. That's what, look, I know of people that were killed in field training. I know police officers that were severely injured and have lifelong disabilities within their first year on the street. And I know some that they decided it just wasn't for them. They weren't cut out for them. And there was a time in my life, Will, where I was very critical of those people. Those days are long gone. And I realized the error of my ways. People serve for as long as they can and do the best job they can. The main thing we always had a philosophy was, we don't care if you're white, black, gay, lesbian, doesn't matter what your religious preference, just do your job. And if I need help, come and help me. If I'm in a brawl and the most thing you can do is grab a hand. That's all we ask you to do. And we got along great. We were a big, huge family. But some people left because they just couldn't do it anymore for whatever reason. And a lot of them became lawyers. They went back to school. What fascinates me is, how does someone go from police work, in your case, from police work to, I'm going to become a college professor? That's not like a sudden jump that most people would imagine. No, it wasn't. And before I was an officer, I did go to college right out of high school, so I already had the bachelor's degree. And when I was deciding after the divorce what I wanted to do, I thought to myself, well, many people in my family are teachers. They're now retired, both of my parents, my sister, cousins, a professor of history. My uncle was a professor of history. So it was kind of in the blood. And my mom had been telling me through most of my 20s, why don't you go into teaching? You'd be great at it. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to do something like law enforcement, or I want to do something more active and what have you. So after the divorce, I was like, what job can I take where I would always have time to go to my kids' stuff and to be there for them? Well, school education, because they had the same schedule. So I started off actually in a private school and worked for the schooling in the Catholic Church for a few years. That's where I met my wife, Rosie. Then I once I finished my master's, I went back to public school, taught at a high school just outside of San Antonio. And then in 2017, when I got my PhD, I was like, well, I'm going to, make the jump to the college level. And so it was about a 10-year process, to get where I am today. But it all kind of started with, how can I be the best father I can be, since I have such a limited time with them? My oldest son is now 17. The other one's going to be 16 this summer. And so, I wanted to make sure that they grew up with a present father. That's admirable. It's really admirable that you did that. And it takes an incredible amount of motivation to go back to school. I'll be honest with you. Well, I went to Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, and I majored in drinking, and I had a minor in sociology. I got a 4.0 on my major and DNF in my minor. I was out within about a year. So the thought of going back to school, and the funny thing is, I was always a lousy student through high school and everything else. When I got to the police academy, I applied myself, worked really hard. I was second in my class. So awesome. It kind of surprised me. It made promotion relatively quickly in a very competitive environment. But I want to get to another point. Hollywood portrays police as being knuckle-dragging idiots, Neanderthals, not deep thinkers. And what you do is the exact opposite. And I want to go back, and I'm not saying this is an anti-you. It's not uncommon. A lot of the men and women we serve with are really, really well educated and are devoted to what they do. And they're very deep thinkers.
Yeah, and I experienced that being Texas State University is now the fourth largest university in Texas, and I remember encountering people. There's this one kid, I'll never forget it. I'm not going to say his name, but I'll never forget him. And he said he was trying to break up a party, and that he wasn't being cooperative. At one point, he says, "Look, being a cop is what happens, and all you can do is high school," or something to that effect. And little did he know that I had gone to Texas A&M. The guy I was working with was the sergeant, had a master's degree in criminal justice, and things like that. But that perception, that they're knuckle draggers, is definitely still prevalent, especially among, the professional class. And I would just tell them, I've got 3 degrees. Police work is a ton of information to have to know. Traffic code, penal code, code of criminal procedures, tactics, your policy manual, and then you have to factor in the totality of the circumstances. So it's a very mentally demanding job, not just in dealing with the stress, but also dealing with just the amount of responsibility you have and to apply that knowledge correctly, because, when you have the power to take away someone's liberty, or in some cases someone's life, if a deadly force situation arises, that's a great responsibility. There's a lot of things that go into that people don't understand.
The Spider-Man quote comes back again about great responsibility. Yeah. So, and this is one thing, I want the best of the best in police work. And I really want us as a community, and it's a large country, but I want us to really take care of our people. We expect they do the best for our community, and we want to take care of them as well. Because when I have an emergency, I want the best law enforcement officers showing up. I don't want someone having a bad day, and I certainly don't want the B team showing up. So you are a professor, and you've also written this book, The Blue Divide, Policing and Race in America. Now, in the college environment, I would speculate that people love to throw out their opinions about policing and race. In my situation, look, race of people involved is always a fact. It's rarely a factor of what goes on. What motivated you to write this book?
Well, obviously I was interested in policing, throughout my master's and my PhD. And I guess it all really started in 2014, mainly for me anyways, the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Black Lives Matter became very prominent after that particular police shooting. And I followed the case pretty closely. And of course, we all know the hands up, don't shoot, stuff that got put out there, and the celebrities and athletes were all, doing the hands up, don't shoot thing. And then it turned out it was complete lies.
Right.
And, you go through, I started kind of keeping track of these high profile deaths from police, of Black people from police. And, in every single one of them, I was like, the way people are reporting on it, the way people are viewing it is not correct. And finally, then after George Floyd died, in the rhetoric about defunding the police, or, some of our representatives, like Representative Cori Bush, said we need to abolish the police. They're going that far. I said, enough is enough. These people have no idea what they're talking about. And I felt like I had a unique perspective, being that I'd been a cop even only for 3 years, but as a college professor who I had authored peer-reviewed articles prior to this, that I could bring that academic arm to it and what it's like to actually be on the street.
And I think you do have a unique perspective. Where can people get the book and get in touch with you?
Probably the easiest way to get the book is on Amazon, but it's also available Barnes & Noble, Walmart, Target, those kind of all the major retailers. And then to get a hold of me, follow me on Twitter. That's probably the easiest way. It's at W Moravits23. That's at W Moravits23. Or you can email me at willmoravits@gmail.com. Those are the two quickest ways to engage me if you have questions or.
Well, I thank you for your service. I thank you for what you're doing, and really thank you for being a guest on Law Enforcement Today Show. Very much appreciated.
Oh, I appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
I'd like to thank our guests so much for coming on the Law Enforcement Today radio show. The Law Enforcement Today radio show is a nationally syndicated radio show broadcast on numerous stations once a week and growing. If you enjoyed the podcast version of the show, please do me a big favor. Tell a friend. I'll be back in just a couple days with a brand new episode of the Law Enforcement Today radio show and podcast. Until then, this is John J. Wiley. See ya.